primary responsibility for governance is vested with the board of directors. In some places, we call our council the board of directors. We use the word simultaneously. Some places, they do both. They have both. They have a council and a board of directors. National has a council and a board of directors, as an example. And there are some overarching responsibilities and duties that boards and members have. The first one is they have a responsibility to articulate the prerequisites for membership candidates and orientate new members and periodically self-evaluate their own performance as a group. And that should happen on an annual basis, by the way, where the board sits down and spends a little bit of time evaluating how it's doing its job and being objective and critical about it. How can we make it better next time? It's not so much of spending time looking for fault or blaming, but concentrating on looking forward and saying, how can we be better at what we do next year than we were this year? And then articulating the requirements for being a member in the society. That's pretty much spelled out in the rule and the bylaws and in the manual. But members, the council needs to be reinforcing that at the local level. And then making sure that O&M orientation is also being provided on a regular basis. It also is the backbone of any nonprofit organization, so it's accountable for the stewardship of the public's investment in the charitable mission and all of those stakeholders that Ann shared with you earlier, okay? And being able to communicate with them and tell them what you've been doing with the resources that you're giving is an important function of the board, to make sure that that's happening in a legitimate and regular, organized way. And then nonprofit needs to pursue good business practices while not pursuing profits and focusing on changing lives and providing services that meet real needs and move our vision and our mission forward. So that's your primary responsibility as a board, as a council. So as a board member, individual me, what do I need to know? What do I need to know about the organization and its functions? What's expected of me as a board member? What's my job description? Okay, as a member of the council or the board, it's my job to participate in setting policy, determining programs, direction, setting long and short range goals, approving the annual budget, and you're responsible for the oversight of the fund development efforts, facilities management, if you have facilities under your responsibility, publicity and marketing, leadership development for the society. Leadership development for the society, of course, that is involved in making sure that there's some good leadership in the pipeline coming behind you that can make the organization successful going forward. That's another one of those, I'm going to leave the organization in a better condition than when I found it. Some specific duties. Do you determine the goals and the program directions that are going to achieve those goals that we just talked about? You determine the management policies. You control the operating funds and the capital assets for the use and the benefit of the society. You don't control them for any other reason. You hire and supervise and support and evaluate and on some occasions terminate the executive director or the CEO. You ensure that the legal obligations of the society are met. That can include things like making sure the nonprofit tax exemption status is in good shape, that there's equal opportunity and affirmative action standards are met, that federal and state income and Social Security taxes are paid if you have employees, And that the other kinds of issues that are related to staff are dealt with appropriately, that they're just, and that you have the right kind of public liability insurance to protect the society, its members, its reputation, and its assets. Last year, 350 conferences lost their tax-exempt status and got official notice from the IRS to that effect, and they were shocked. Now, they'd never checked to see that their status was appropriately up to speed, so that's one of the reasons they were shocked. And the other reason they were shocked is because even though for 5 years we said every year, at least 3 times, you have to file a 990 or an N postcard 990 with the federal government, or you will lose your status. Well, for 3 years, they heard us say that, and for 3 years, they didn't file it, and the 4th year, the IRS sent them a letter saying you're no longer tax exempt. Now, the law is very clear. Once you lose your tax exempt status for that reason, you can't just go back and say, fix it and give it back to me. And you also can't join the national group ruling anymore. You have to go and get your own 501c3 tax exempt status separate from everybody else. And you have to pay the $950 that it costs to do that, which is going to be money coming out of the treasury of the society that was probably should have been earmarked for something more valuable. And so not paying attention.
About this much paperwork to file.
And about this much paperwork, yeah, about that much paperwork to file.
Now, those people that just lost their status, though, they were group exempted already, though, right?
Prior, they were exempted prior. That's how they. But that's what they lost. That's what they lost. So then, any donation that they get after that date is from a donor is no longer tax exempt, and now you're obligated to tell the donor who's giving you money the day after you got that letter and beyond till you get it fixed, that their donation is not tax deductible. Because if you don't tell them that and they file their tax returns believing that they gave you a tax deduction and the IRS checks their return against your status and discovers that you're not in status, then the donor gets in trouble with the IRS for trying to claim a tax deduction that they're not entitled to. And not most donors, even though they don't always donate because of the tax exemption, if they do claim it and you didn't inform them properly, they're not going to be particularly happy with you, that they're now dealing with an IRS problem that they wouldn't have had to deal with at all, right? So the other responsibilities of a board are you approve grants and contracts and leases and approve other legal documents that are consistent with your bylaws. And you ensure that the personnel and the volunteer policies are properly administrated, okay? Not having the right policies in place can cause you liability issues with your insurance company. Some places got in trouble because they didn't have the right policies in place in this area, and they had a supervisor who was beating up on volunteers inappropriately. I don't necessarily mean physically, but harassing them. And they filed a lawsuit, and they won the lawsuit, and guess where the money came out of? Came out of the society's treasury. That money was earmarked for something else, wasn't it? So that needs to be you need to pay attention to that. You create and execute a diversified fund development program. So the board of directors is responsible to make sure that the council or and its entities have the necessary resources it needs to function and operate. Okay? It's not, a board of directors can't say, oh, that's not my job. I'm not responsible for money. Yes, you are. You're responsible for raising the funds necessary to do what you claim to be in business to do. Okay? Individually, you should contribute financially to the organization. There is no requirement that it be a specific amount. And there's no requirement that it be publicized. Okay? It's important that every member of the board contribute according to their own means to the organization's efforts. That would be true in any organization you belong to. That's not something that's unique to the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. As a board member, you would participate in designated fundraising activities. Not everybody's comfortable with fundraising, and that's okay. Not everybody has to be. Hopefully you'll have some skilled people around that are helping you get the job done. But you can be there you can be very critically helpful by just lending your physical support, your presence to those kinds of activities, even if you aren't writing a big check and even if you aren't organizing and talking to major donors. Your presence can make a big difference to the other stakeholders who do show up. You represent the organization in the community, and you participate in the annual board retreat that establishes long and short-term goals. That's the whole notion of strategic planning, that takes us out into the future. That's one of your critical functions after selecting the right staff person if you're hiring staff, or selecting the right leadership if that's how you're operating on a total volunteer basis. And then the other job is to attend the board meetings, and if you're assigned to a committee, to participate in those committee meetings as effectively as you can. The other responsibilities are the board is responsible for setting up annual salary guidelines and benefit packages. And you're responsible for the leadership development of the staff and the board. Make sure that there's adequate funds for accomplishing leadership training. That's another area that gets neglected. But you're responsible for the future leadership of the organization, so you need to make sure the current leadership is being trained properly and the future leadership is being trained. And you can't do that without allocating some kind of resources to that effort. Participate in the annual board evaluation. That's a critical element when the board should be looking at what it's accomplished and what it plans to do on an annualized basis. And participating in that evaluation is a critical responsibility of a board member. And then every one of you have skills and talents that you can share at that level. So making sure that those are being made available, and if you don't have them, but you likely know somebody who does, that's another way to bring that skill set into the organization, because as we said earlier, not everybody has to be a Vincentian to be able to bring their skills and talents to the table. There's lots of ways to do that. You have to understand that the board is a team composed of individual members. When the board makes a decision, regardless of if it's reached by consensus or by a vote, that decision is then the decision of the entire organization, the entire board. And you may have individually not supported that. You might have thought there was a better way or another way, and so you may have even voted no on a particular proposal. But once the decision is made, your job as a board member is to support that decision. And if you can't, then you need to think about whether you're in the right place. And maybe the better thing to do would be to move on. Find another place where you can use your skills and talents more effectively. And then the last one there is assisting with community, public relations, and marketing services in the organization. That's getting the word out. Sometimes you can do that just because you happen to run into somebody who knows the editor of the newspaper, or who knows the general manager at a television station, or who knows a reporter. So those kinds of linkages and those kinds of connections can become valuable assets for the organization, and you can make the connections for them. So what do you need to know about the organization and its functions? You need to have sufficient material and information so that you can make, and so the board can make, informed decisions. So you need to understand, well, what's this organization about? What's its structure? How does it work? You need to have some sense of the organizational planning and what are the program services that are offered. And when somebody comes on new, especially if they're moving up the ladder and they're coming on new, these can all be blank areas for them. Even though they've been around the organization for some time, they may not have been privy to all of this detailed information, and so we shouldn't assume that they understand it or even know it. But those are the kinds of things they need to know in order to be able to do that, to make well-informed decisions. So they need to have copies of the articles of incorporation and the bylaws and the mission statement. They need to understand what the legal structure is. They need to know that it's a tax-exempt, IRS tax-exempt status, and how is that derived? How do you get that? We're going to talk more about that later. That it's a legal structure, that there's a relationship, that you're part of you're not just a little organization operating in a little tiny space. You're part of a larger organization that's in both national and international in scope. And that there are certain applicable state regulations as well as federal regulations that the organization is required to follow. And none of those things are secretive. I mean, you don't have to wait till you're the president to know these things. None of this stuff is top secret. It won't hurt if anybody knows it, if everybody knows it. Okay. So if you go into rule and you go into the bylaws and you go into the manual, you're going to find a job description that deals with these kinds of things that are listed here, so I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on it. People should have access to the budget and the menu and the minutes, and they should be getting those in a timely fashion. Okay? In order to make good decisions, you have to have good information. Two of those pieces of information are the minutes and the budget reports. And then if there are policies and procedures that are already in place, new board members in particular, and even sometimes existing members, need to be reminded that we have certain policies and procedures in place, and this is what they are, and this is where they're at. And there should be a clear board calendar so that people aren't surprised about when and what we do and when we do it. There should be a planning cycle that the board goes through on a regular basis so that there aren't surprises about that and you feel like you're being forced to make fast decisions. That stuff should be planned and calendarized out. That's not a complex piece of information. Most of that stuff can be accomplished by having a conversation about planning as part of your regular agenda item and make those decisions as a group. It's always a good idea for the board to have some kind of an annual retreat, to spend time in reflection and working together and looking forward. And the retreat opportunity is a good one for doing that. You need to know if there are staff involved, what the assignments are, what the current programs are, if there are volunteers involved and what are their functions. None of this is secret information and should be easily shared and communicated up and down the organization. If you have a facility, then board members should make sure that they're regularly visiting that facility because they have some responsibility for the condition of it. Then you should also make sure that they understand where the money comes from, what's the income sources, and what are the current expenses, monthly, year-to-date line items. So, and you need that kind of information in order to prepare yourself for meetings and to participate in an intelligent way during the discussions. And it moves the discussions to another level. And you're not having emotional discussions or discussions that are emotional loaded because there's a lack of information and a lack of knowledge about what's being talked about at a given point in time. When that gap exists, it pushes people to that next level of dealing from the emotional level. And that emotional level can come in many different ways. It can be frustration over the fact that I'm a board member and you haven't told me what's going on, or I know it should have been done and somebody dropped the ball, but you're still forced to deal with it at that emotional level, which is not very helpful in the last analysis. So that the planning approach and the getting things organized and making sure everybody has the right information when they need it makes a big difference. Make sure that the board members understand that there is a time commitment and what are the constraints that the board members are operating under. So to ignore that there are constraints at the board table that are impinging on them and not having that conversation and making adjustments in your schedules and so forth just adds to people's frustration and makes them ineffective at the table. Okay, so then you can educate yourself on the society about all of these things, and all of this stuff is readily available. None of this is secretive or hard to find. And if you don't know where it is, the website, the national website, will certainly provide every piece of the information, and you can order some of it directly from the national office. Officers should be making sure that that kind of stuff is already in the hands of the members so that they don't have to go looking for it. So you're expected to be knowledgeable and to participate. And that effective participation comes in this area here, where you accept some responsibility for the board's efforts at being successful. You're not leaving it to somebody else. It's not somebody else's job. It's your job to make sure that the organization is being successful, individually and collectively. At least make an effort to serve on one committee and advocate for the society and the people that it serves. Contribute financially if you can. Participate in discussions. Stay abreast of the information, and recognize the other members of the team and their contributions and efforts as well. I'm not going to go through this. I think you can read that on your own. Okay, some of the other things that help being an effective board member in the area of constraints is to make sure that there's no conflict of interest going on with you and the organization. That doesn't have to be. There isn't a problem with there being a conflict of interest. The problem is if it's not known. Okay, it's the fact that it's a secret that becomes the real problem, not the fact that you might have a relationship that puts you on the inside track to do a certain kind of job, and your company or your organization benefits from that. That's not necessarily in itself a conflict. It's the fact that it's not disclosed that's where it becomes the conflict.
You're supposed to sign that every year.
And there is a form that we ask all leadership members to sign every year. It's called the Conflict of Interest form. And presidents, councils should be encouraging council officers to sign it and council board members to sign it at the local level.
And it's one of those questions on the 990, whether you have a conflict of interest.
That's a good point. That's new.
Yes, that's one of the new questions.
The 990 has evolved into a governance tool for the IRS because they used to just ask how much money did you take in and how much money did you spend and who got the most of it, for what purpose. Now there's 36 pages of questions and answers. Most of them are check the box because they ask the question in a way that you can answer yes or no. So do we have a conflict of interest form? Yes or no. Do we have a stakeholders report? Yes or no. They ask the question in a way in which you can answer it easily, but they're all governance questions, and they're all designed to find out if you're collecting money from the general public, are you using it in a way that's consistent with how the general public perceives nonprofits should be operating? Okay. Understanding the role differences between a paid staff member and a board member. That's another place when that's ignored, where organizations get into trouble in our society. Your job is not to do the management's job or the staff's job, if that's what you have, or the volunteer's job, if that's what you have. To support the decisions of the board, I mentioned that earlier, even though you may not vote for it. And if you find that you're unable to support the decisions that the board is making, then you need to make an honest evaluation about whether that's the right place for you. You don't have to make judgments about it, good or bad. It's just a question that you need to answer for yourself and then act appropriately. But to vote against something the board decided to do the majority decided they're going to go south, and then for you to go out into the community or in the organization and badmouth that decision or talk against that decision is inappropriate, to say the least, problematic, to say the very best. That you're going to be able to accomplish is create confusion and chaos in the organization where it's not necessary or needed.